In getting to the past years, I've made certain observations. There are essentially two groups of people in the church. There are single folks and there are married folks. That seems pretty straightforward, right? And getting to counsel singles and marrieds, many times it kind of falls under this sort of, I guess you could say, framework. There are singles who wrestle with their singleness, and there are some who think that marriage will make everything work out well. So they're trying to get married. Then on the other side, there are those who are married. And after a little while being married, they realize there are some challenges in marriage. And some will even go as far as to say, I didn't think it'd be this hard. And so they look back at their single years and go, life seemed more simple back then. I was talking about this with someone, and they used a very interesting image. It's like there's a screen door, and there's flies on the outside trying to get in, and then there's flies on the inside trying to get out. In other words, everyone's kind of wrestling with where they're at. Now, we look at our world today, and you can see that there are a lot of problems. And essentially, there are those two same groups of people. There are singles, and they're single for various reasons. There are those who are unmarried. There are those who are maybe widowed. There are those who are maybe divorced or abandoned. So they're single. And then you have those that are married. Now, back in the time of the early church, and we're going to look at 1 Corinthians 7 for a portion of today, the Corinthian church had a lot of issues. And one of the really interesting things about those times, I mean, we think our times are a little complicated now. They had a lot of complicated things back then, too, even in how they understood the very idea of marriage. You know, if you grow up in the church, I think we have a certain sort of idea that's set. You know, you go to a wedding, you see two people get married, they go through a ceremony. Essentially, we see this from a Christian standpoint. Whether it's actually biblical or not might be an issue, but we have this sort of Christian tradition of how we see marriage. And we think that maybe that's the way it is, that this is the way it's been. But actually, and I was thinking about this week, isn't marriage an interesting concept that no matter what culture, whatever part of the world you're in, they have something that they consider to be special about marriage. And they'll have a particular sort of ceremony, whether it's Christian or secular or whatever religious background it might be. But there's something that's upheld about marriage. And you see that throughout the world. Now, I wanted to address a few things, and it's going to be hard to do this just in 2 Sundays. It's today and next week. I wanted to address sort of this perspective of how do we deal with singleness, how do we deal with marriage, how do we deal with parenting, and how do we deal with children. Now, everyone here has experienced at least 2 of those categories. Okay? You've been a child, or you still are a child. You have parents, right? You might be an adult child, but you're a child. And you are single. At least everyone here has been or is currently single. And so, to some degree, you could probably testify as to some of the challenges that you faced. And today we want to kind of focus on singleness and marriage. If you look at our current culture, there really is a war against singleness and marriage. And this war is one of a spiritual nature. That's why I asked Danny to read that portion this morning. When you look at Ephesians 6, we have to remember that there is a war that's going on that we cannot see. Now, we see in our world how people are quick to cast aside God's truth. And they want to create their own definitions. And this is actually somewhat ironic and hypocritical, because the very people who change the definitions don't want other people to define things for them. So they'll create their own definitions, and they'll also insist that you must agree with their definitions. In fact, not only do you have to accept it, you have to abide by it. Now we look at what is really one of the most fundamental human institutions, and that's marriage and the family. And now we see that these two institutions, which were designed by God, have been turned upside down. And you see agendas that are diametrically opposed to God's design. I mean, people are unashamed, especially in wanting to indoctrinate children with what is a male and female? What is marriage all about? I mean, you see that there is just no hesitation now to teach even very young children the things that they want. Now, when we look at all these relational dynamics, we can see that the world has a complete disregard for God, for His Word, for His design, and for His purposes. But if you don't know God, that's understandable. In fact, for those of you who kind of keep up with current events, politics, and so forth, and we see things happening, we see things being, shared in the media, we shouldn't be surprised that there is a suppression of the truth. Romans 1:18 says, even though they know God, they will suppress the truth in unrighteousness. Even though they know God, they will choose not to glorify Him as God or give thanks, but instead will become futile in their thoughts, and their foolish hearts will be darkened. Romans 1:21. So we shouldn't be surprised what we see going on in our world. I mean, it should bother you. In fact, there should be, in a sense, a righteous anger when you see things that are done that contradict God's truth. But we have to remember, those who do not know Christ cannot know or understand the things of God because they don't have the Spirit of God residing within them. 1 Corinthians 2:14 says, the natural man does not understand the things of God. If you try to negotiate with someone who is an unbeliever about God's truth, you should not be surprised that they simply will reject it. In fact, it is understandable that there is even a disdain, a contempt, as well as a complete rejection against God's truth. But here's where there's a little different perspective to consider. What is very discouraging is that when there are those who claim to be Christians and profess to be children of God, and instead of a loving obedience and submission to God's truth, they will take what God intended for good and turn it into something that God did not intend. Now I want to take the issue of singleness. For a lot of people in the church, and this is unfortunate in some ways because sometimes married folks can contribute to this, it's that singleness is a second-class position. That you are not fulfilled until you get married. In fact, there are some marrieds who are so keen on wanting to help their single friends get married that they'll just do anything they can to set them up with someone and not necessarily consider what is the point of getting married. It's not just that you get people married off. We have to ask ourselves, do we see marriage in light of what God designed it to be? Now, apart from that, singleness can be a season where there are many challenges. But when you turn to 1 Corinthians 7, and we're going to kind of go back and forth from that and some other passages. Amongst other issues involved, there is one thing that singleness does provide. It provides an opportunity for you to be concerned about the things of the Lord so that you may please the Lord. Look at chapter 7, verse 32 of 1 Corinthians 7. It says, "But I want you to be free from concern. One who is unmarried is concerned about the things of the Lord, how he may please the Lord." That contrasts that in the next verse. "But one who is married is concerned about the things of the world, how he may please his wife, and his interests have been divided. The woman who is unmarried and the virgin is concerned about the things of the Lord, that she may be holy both in holy and spirit. But one who is married is concerned about the things of the world, how she may please her husband." Now we're going to develop that a little bit more, just so you make sure Paul's not saying that singleness or marriage is better than the other. But there's a certain observation here. In fact, we could say it this way. As a single, you have this opportunity to be concerned about the things of the Lord in a way that's different from those who are married. There is simply a practical reality. You don't have to be concerned about things as you would if you were married. Now, our current culture really has seen this very darkening degeneration. In fact, I don't know if there's another generation that is so unashamedly and blatantly told to be selfish. Life is all about you. Life is all about you pursuing what you want in order to be fulfilled. Biblically, we would call it this. It's a love for self. A love for self. Now, this is not new, but I think in our current culture, it really has been established as the highest value. And no one is allowed to question your love for yourself. And that's why a lot of times you run into a lot of trouble at church, because God's word does not support that kind of thinking. But in this world, you are not allowed to question, you're not allowed to admonish, you're not allowed to correct, or else you'll be accused of hate speech. Now, 2 Timothy 3, starting from verse 1, it says, "But know this, that in the last days difficult times will come. For men will be lovers of self, lovers of money, boastful, arrogant, blasphemers, disobedient to parents, ungrateful, unholy, unloving, irreconcilable, malicious gossips, without self-control, without gentleness, without love for good, treacherous, reckless, conceited, lovers of pleasure rather than lovers of God, holding to a form of godliness but having denied its power. Keep away from such men as these." Now again, love of self is not a new thing. You see that Paul writes about it even back then. But it goes all the way back to Genesis 3. Love of self is woven into the very fabric of sin from the beginning. Now, love of self doesn't mean that you are not allowed to care for yourself. We're not promoting self-hatred. We're not saying you have to show contempt for your own life. In fact, in Luke chapter 14, verses 26 and 27, Jesus says something that seems so outrageous people don't understand it. He says this, "If anyone comes to me and does not hate his own father and mother and wife and children and brothers and sisters, yet and even his own life, he cannot be my disciple. Whoever does not carry his own cross and come after me cannot be my disciple." Now, do you think Jesus is advocating for hatred for people, for your own family members, even for yourself? Well, if you look at the context, he's addressing the heart of what it means to follow him. You cannot have competition with Jesus as Lord of your life. To follow Jesus is to love Jesus. To no longer live for yourself, but for him. There have been so many times I've shared 2 Corinthians 5:14 and 15 with you. For the love of Christ controls us, having concluded this, that one died for all, therefore all died. And he died for all, so that they who live would no longer live for themselves, but for him who died and rose again on their behalf. So the question that we all have to ask ourselves is this: does the love of Christ control me? Does it control me because I understand that Jesus died for me? And why did he die for me? So that I would no longer live for myself. In fact, we are not live for really anyone else either. A life that loves self. Ask yourselves, why are people so easily offended? It's because their love for self collides with others who are just as committed to loving themselves. And so it is not surprising to see conflict be the result. You see this even in young children, right? I'm sure those of you who work in the nursery, as soon as they're able to move around and start grabbing a toy, what do you see happen? They'll fight over a toy. And why is it that kids, they learn the word mine so quick? Mine, mine, it's mine, it's mine. They don't learn it's yours, it's yours. I've never seen a baby first say it's yours. It's always mine. But even as adults, we might not say it that way, but that's how we live. It's about me. Why are you not agreeing with me? Why are you not doing things that please me? Maybe because we don't really understand how powerful self-love is, this love for self. That even as a Christian, it could be something that you really struggle with. You see, if someone who is born with the love of self is never confronted and admonished and corrected in that love for self, they will take that love of self into marriage. And so you wonder why so many marriages have problems. It's because the love of self is still there. Now, if you're single, you need to ask yourself, is Christ enough? Is Christ enough? Or could it be that there's such a pull from the flesh that this challenge of dealing with love for self is something that I have to keep fighting? I mean, if you remember, love for self defines those who do not know Christ. But how is it that we're still okay with letting that affect how we live? Everyone starts off single in life. I mean, even if you get arranged at birth, you're still single. Some will get married. Those who are single might think getting married is the epitome of life fulfillment. But here's something very sobering to consider. Marriage is temporary. Marriage is temporary. It's a temporary status. I mean, to put it maybe in a very practical way, when you're single, you want to get to the next step, right? So you want to date. So maybe at some point you get to date. Maybe one of those dating situations works out to the point where you get engaged. And as you're engaged, at least if you're here at Lighthouse, we encourage you to go through premarital counseling. And during the course of premarital counseling, what do you find out? you find out that your fiance has a lot of issues. Not me, of course. They have a lot of issues. Now, there are some who don't go through premarital counseling. And, it's maybe a very sad thing in that some don't take you seriously, that you got to actually prepare for marriage. You don't just prepare for a wedding day. I mean, it is amazing when I see how much time, energy, and money people will put into planning a wedding and how very little time they put into actually preparing for marriage itself. And then the wedding day is over. You're married. Yay! We went to your wedding. We got to see you get married. And then what happens? You come back from your honeymoon, and that's why the idea of the honeymoon period is over, because you don't get an indefinite honeymoon. You got to come back and deal with reality. You got to take care of where you live. You got to figure out how to work your schedules. And then children maybe come along the way. And you find out that life gets pretty complicated. So married life is very, very different from single life. Now, marriage, instead of seeing marriage as a calling to magnify Christ and to be a picture of the covenant relationship Christ has with his bride, the church, married folks will turn marriage into literally an idol factory. It's about seeking your own kingdom, establishing your own domain, building out your dream. Now, it's a little outdated and old-fashioned, but you talk about the American dream of getting married, 2 kids, single-family home with a white picket fence. But it's still a picture in mind in which you say, once I be happy. But what happens when you find out nations? In fact, your spouse disappoints you frequently. You find out that marriage is not all that it was cut out to be. You start to entertain even thoughts of divorce early on. Maybe you find out also that your spouse is not satisfied with you. They look elsewhere for fulfillment. So your heart is crushed. Maybe you find out that your spouse is not as loving as you thought they would be. Maybe you have parents or in-laws issues that make life difficult, whether they're Christians or not. Or you might face various trials and hardships, whether they be financial or health or other situations, and it places a tremendous strain. At times you might feel it's unbearable. So then what are we supposed to do with that? What do we do when marriage is not what we thought it would be? In fact, it's a lot more difficult. Well, that's why I want to give you some perspective here. And we're not going to address every particular, but I do want to give you a big picture perspective. We are in a state of war. We are in a spiritual war, and we have to remember, go to Ephesians chapter 6. We're going to look at it again. Verse 10, it says, finally be strong in the Lord and in the might of his strength. So Paul is saying, hey, there's a war. You need to get your armor on. Why do we need to put on the full armor of God? So that you will be able to stand firm against the schemes of the devil. I mean, if any of you follow politics, you understand that there are people with very, very clear agendas that they're trying to accomplish. We should be concerned. But what you should be even more concerned about is that there is an agenda that the devil has. He is scheming. And he's been doing this from Genesis 3. Verse 12, for our struggle is not against flesh and blood. Sometimes when we have problems with people or material situations, we think that's the actual problem. When actually the greater struggle is not against flesh and blood, but it's against the rulers, against the authorities, against the world forces of this darkness, against the spiritual forces of wickedness in the heavenly places. When you think about everything that's going on in the world, and sometimes it just seems like it's so irrational. It's so crazy. I mean, you think about, say, for instance, the whole transgender issue, where you have young people being told it's okay to mutilate your body because you need to match what you feel you are on the inside with what you are on the outside. In fact, it's such an issue that parents are not even being allowed to be part of dealing with that process. Now, I don't know about you, Angela and I have 4 girls. And in raising them up, what you hope for is that they would grow up to love Christ and to become the kind of people that would love the Lord and follow him. But when Christ is no longer Lord or acknowledged as Lord or submitted to as Lord, what do you see? Well, what you see, and we wrestle with this in a very real way, is that they can follow another agenda. I mean, initially it might seem like it's not too bad. We say focus on your dreams, pursue your education, find a good job, be successful, enjoy your social life. And people will do that. And what we don't realize is, are we advocating actually for idolatry? And that you would say, these are all things that are so valuable. And of course we might say, well, yes, you need to be a Christian. Yes, you need to love God. But do we actually have a concern that they love God and follow him? There are those who claim to be Christians, but if you were to look at how they live, you'd have to wonder, do they actually love Jesus? Or do they love other things? Just by the sheer amount of time and energy and money you put into things, if you were to measure that. And I think that's why for so many who are going through that season of singleness, you have to ask yourself, so what are you actually living for? Because if you do get married, and that's not that it's the ultimate thing to end up with, if you get married, what do you bring into that marriage? Do you bring a love for Christ? Or do you bring a love for other things? There's the saying that you worship what you love. So what do you love? Even in marriage, you can take all those things that you were focused on in your single life. Now you just simply add another dimension. And you will find very quickly that you no longer have the kind of freedom and the ability to just pursue what you want, because you do have to be concerned about someone else now. Now, some people make marriage itself an idol because you actually believe it will make you more fulfilled than your relationship with God. Now, those who are single will find themselves maybe discontent because they're not married. Either way, singleness or marriage can reveal that there is a severe lack of contentment and also an embarrassing amount of love for self. And you go back to that 2 Timothy 3 passage, love for money, love for material things, love for pleasure, rather than love of God. In fact, there's also the loving of wrong things. The fact that some are unloving or without love for good, that's also in that 2 Timothy 3 passage. So what do you love? Do you love the right things? Or do you love the wrong things? Now, again, if we consider the unbelieving world, we can't be surprised by that sort of description. But again, what we're talking about here is if you say that you're a Christian, is it okay that you would be more like the world than you are what Christ calls you to be? We have to understand the war, the spiritual war, is not just out there in the world. The war is also in the church. And this, I just wanted to address that. You know, over the years, I led the singles ministry down in San Diego. I led it here for a while too. So I got a chance to see how single people operate. Now, I got married pretty early on. I got married at 23. And next week, we get to celebrate our 35th anniversary. So I've been married much longer than I've been single. And I remember when I was dating Ange, and as we got engaged, I remember I was really, really excited, just like anyone else would be. And then when I got married, I was excited. But I also learned that there were a lot of challenges. It wasn't easy. There are many, many blessings that you can experience when you're single, and there are many, many blessings you can experience when you're married. But I want you to think at a very, very foundational level here. Whether you're single or married, do you consider the glory of God? So let's talk about singleness to the glory of God. 1 Corinthians 10:31 says, whether then you eat or drink or whatever you do, do all to the glory of God. And in application, I just kind of thought of this phrase. Whether then you are single or married, or whatever you are, do all to the glory of God. For those of you who are single, can you say with a genuine heart that you see singleness as a season to glorify God? Or do you somehow see it as a second-class status? Again, I want to encourage our married folks, as much as you would be wanting to see our single folks here get married, don't make that the main agenda. Marriage actually isn't for everybody. Now, we want to be careful. We don't want to go to the extreme of like the Roman Catholic Church, where they created celibacy to be the highest spiritual status. And if you study Catholic Church history, where these priests were all supposed to be celibate, they had entire villages populated with their children out of wedlock. That's not good. You know, sometimes there are folks who are, again, well-intentioned and well-meaning, and so they set their friends up with someone who they say is a Christian. But they might not necessarily share the same convictions or even foundational beliefs. And more often than not, that relationship will kind of edge toward the side of the person who doesn't agree with what we might teach here. And so you need to be careful. But if you just take singleness in itself, what is your perspective toward it? John Piper, in his book, This Momentary Marriage, gives some very, very helpful principles to consider. First, the truth that the family of God grows not by propagation through sexual intercourse, but by regeneration through faith in Christ. Okay, now that's a pretty straightforward statement. God's people, the family of God, doesn't simply grow biologically because you engage in sexual relations. It grows by regeneration through faith in Christ. Now, I think we might say we agree with that, but sometimes I think there is sort of this passive attitude of the church that we're just simply going to grow biologically, and that's fine. But that doesn't guarantee those who are born and raised up here automatically are saved. It's a sobering thought. Secondly, the truth that relationships in Christ are more permanent and are more precious than relationships in families. And of course, it is wonderful when relationships in families are also relationships in Christ, but we know that is often not the case. Sometimes that's a sad realization, that you could actually be closer to someone who is not part of your biological family. But the truth is, a relationship in Christ is more permanent and actually can be more precious. I think from a counseling standpoint, next to premarital and marriage, the next biggest issue is always family. There are those who have unbelieving parents, unbelieving siblings, unbelieving relatives. And you think that somehow, aren't we supposed to be close? Well, it is wonderful when our parents or our siblings or our relatives are fellow Christians. But we understand that there is really rarely the case where all of those people will be Christians. Third, the truth that marriage is temporary and finally gives way to the relationship to which it was pointing all along, Christ and the church. The way a picture is no longer needed when you see face to face. Now, this is not to, again, diminish marriage in any way, but do we understand marriage is temporary? One day, one of the spouses will pass away. And so you will have to face the reality of being single again. But if we understand our theology, we know that marriage is temporary. And it will give way to something which is much bigger, and that's Christ and the church. Because that's what marriage was supposed to point to all along. Fourth, the truth that faithfulness to Christ defines the value of life. All other relationships get their final significance from this. No family relationship is ultimate. Relationship to Christ is. Now that could sound so blunt, but, and this is where you really then have to ask yourself, does my relationship with Christ truly define me? Faithfulness to Christ defines the value of life. All relationships, all other relationships get their final significance from this. No family relationship is ultimate. I think of that as a parent. And in no way do I want to, rain on anyone's life right now because your kids are little, so you're like, don't talk about this yet. But your kids will grow up. Okay? One day they will run around and they will start to exert their will in ways more and more that you'll find contrary to what you hope for them. It's just the reality. Think of yourself now in how, as an adult, you relate to your parents. Do you simply just do whatever your parents tell you to do? We might maybe outwardly agree or concede, while inwardly we still might be embittered or resentful. But it's no surprise that people start to separate in terms of their family relationships. I think instead of avoiding the discussion of singleness, we need to really think carefully through this. What does the Bible have to say about this topic of singleness? Think of it from a big picture standpoint. What really matters? What is ultimate? We have to ask ourselves these things. Now turn to 1 Corinthians chapter 7, and we're not going to go through every detail of this, but there's instruction, Paul. And it's a very interesting perspective because he actually says, this is not a command of the Lord, but this is my opinion. Look at 1 Corinthians chapter 7, verse 25. Now concerning virgins, I have no command of the Lord, but I give an opinion as one who by the mercy of the Lord is trustworthy. Now that statement alone, how do you take that? Do you focus on, it's just his opinion, so I don't have to think about this? Or do you see the part where it says, as one who by the mercy of the Lord is trustworthy? What he has to say here, even though it's not mandated, he's saying, you know what? I think you can trust what I'm about to share. It's my opinion. I think then that this is good because of the present distress, that it is good for a man to remain as he is. Are you bound to a wife? Do not seek to be released. Are you released from a wife? Do not seek a wife. But if you marry, you have not sinned. And if a virgin marries, she has not sinned. Yet such will have trouble in this life, and I'm trying to spare you. Now, do you understand why he's saying this is his opinion? Okay. At first glance, you might think, wow, Paul, it's a little rough here. If you marry, you haven't sinned. I mean, imagine hearing that at a wedding ceremony. You're getting married. Well, you haven't sinned. And if you just left it at that, it wouldn't sound too encouraging. Then he says, yet such will have trouble in this life, and I'm trying to spare you. Now, Paul is writing from the perspective of one who is single. We don't have enough information to know for sure. He was part of the Sanhedrin, and one of the requirements actually was that they be married. He might have been widowed, but at the time of his writing, he is single because he's saying, this is where I'm at. Jump down to verse 32. It says, but I want you to be free from concern. One who is unmarried is concerned about the things of the Lord, how he may please the Lord. But one who is married is concerned about the things of the world, how he may please his wife. And his interests have been divided. The woman who is unmarried, the virgin is concerned about the things of the Lord, that she may be holy both in body and spirit. But one who is married is concerned about the things of the world, how she may please her husband. Now this I say for your own benefit, not to put a restraint upon you, but to promote propriety and undistracted devotion to the Lord. Now there is a reality. If you are single, if you are not married, you will not be distracted by the things that marriage brings. And it's not that those distractions are bad things, but they do take time and energy. To be single is to be free of concern for someone else, as marriage would bring. Now, I would point this out. Whether you're single or married, you should be concerned about the things of the Lord. You should be concerned about pleasing the Lord. So it's not just saying those who are single, you're able to do this only because you're single. But he is pointing out something about the reality of being single. One who is unmarried is concerned about the things of the Lord, how he may please the Lord. Now, those of you who are single, go talk to someone who's married and ask them, so what's it like being married versus what it was like being single? And I think they can tell you that there is a pretty significant difference. But aside from the differences, let's focus on what we do see here in this verse. Are you concerned about the things of the Lord? And are you concerned about how you may please the Lord? At the heart of many singles is the struggle in being content in their singleness. And we understand that's a reality. There are some who get so anxious about this that they start to question whether they'll ever find someone, so that becomes the predominant thought in their mind, which then affects how they view everything else. But I'd like to encourage you, what Paul's saying here. He is not saying that marriage is a bad thing. But when you are single, you have an opportunity to learn to grow, to trust the Lord with your marital status. You know, there are some singles that make marriage to be so much an idol that they are willing to marry an unbeliever. And that is something that is completely against the glory of God. I mean, no matter how you try to make it work. You know, there are some who advocate for dating evangelism, right? Date unbelievers so you can get them saved. No. It doesn't work that way. There are some who would marry an unbeliever. They bind their lives into someone who does not share what is the most important conviction and priority in their life. There are also some who are so desperate to get married that they might just marry anyone who claims to be a Christian, and they compromise their doctrine, their practice, just so that they can be married. There are even some who have been brutally honest. They said they just want to get married so that they can have sexual relations. That was the biggest reason. So that's why I ask you, is the glory of God your greatest concern? Because if it's not, you will seek other things, and you're going to find out that those things will not ultimately satisfy. You might experience some temporary fulfillment, but the realities of life will quickly reveal the state of your heart. If you say you subscribe to the sovereignty of God in your life, you being single is not an accident or a mistake. And it's not just that it is by default. You are single so that you might live to the glory of God. And however long you are single, even if it is for the rest of your life, would it reflect a life that seeks the glory of God? I want to give you an example of this. Turn to Luke chapter 2. And in verse 36 to 38, and this is right after Jesus is born, Joseph and Mary take him to the temple. Okay, first they meet Simeon, who had been promised by God that he would see the Messiah. And right after that, we read this. And there was a prophetess, Luke 2, verse 36, Anna, the daughter of Phanuel of the tribe of Asher. She was advanced in years, having lived with her husband 7 years from when she was a virgin, and then as a widow to the age of 84. She never left the temple, serving night and day with fastings and prayers. And at that very moment she came up and began giving thanks to God and continued to speak of him to all those who were waiting for the redemption of Jerusalem. So picture this. Anna, she was married for 7 years. And typically at that time, they married pretty early. She might have been in her mid-teens even, maybe 15 or so. She is married for 7 years, and then her husband dies. She is a widow to the age of 84. And at the time when Jesus comes with Joseph and Mary, this is how it describes Anna. She never left the temple. She was serving night and day with fastings and prayers. And so when Joseph and Mary bring Jesus, and this is all that we know of Anna. There's really no other mention of her. So what we see here is what defines her in the description of her life. Anna came up and began giving thanks to God. She was characterized by being thankful. And Anna continued to speak of him to all those who were waiting for the redemption of Jerusalem. You could say she was characterized by speaking and proclaiming the gospel of Jesus. So gratitude and gospel, that's what defined Anna. Till the age of 84. I mean, I think that's an amazing description. I mean, you read about all the people who are mentioned in the Bible. Some are remembered for not so good things. Even they have a very short mention, but it's not very glorifying to God. And I think about Anna here. She's a widow for most of her life. But what are the standout qualities? Gratitude and the gospel. Gratitude and the gospel. Whether you're single for whatever reason, unmarried, divorce, abandonment, your spouse has died, would you still be defined by being thankful? In 1 Thessalonians 5:18, we just looked at that, right? In everything give thanks, for this is the will of God in Christ Jesus. Your marital status should never define why you are gratitude or why you are grateful or not. You should always be grateful. Your marital status should never affect your heart to the point where you stop proclaiming the gospel. Again, remember, marriage is a temporary status. Whether you are single or married, at the end of the day, when we reach heaven, eternity will be defined by our relationship with Christ. Remember, Jesus says in heaven there's no longer marriage. And in some ways that could seem a little sad because you're like, well, then what was the point of all of it? The point of it was that you were there to glorify God, whether you're single or married. You were always meant to point to Christ. We should never treat singleness or marriage with disdain or contempt. Instead, can we be content with that simple purpose statement that whether we are single or married, that we would do all to the glory of God? I think we have to be reminded of that basic foundational definition of our lives. Do you live to the glory of God, whether you're single or whether you're married? You know, sometimes it seems like everyone has an excuse. Well, it's because I'm single. This and this and this. It's because I'm married. This and this and this. It's because I have kids. This and this and this. Well, whatever it might be, there is no justification to not seek the glory of God first. Doesn't matter what status you are. Now, I'm going to have to continue next week on the marriage part. But when you think about the picture of marriage, and maybe if you can do this, maybe this will help give a little bit of a different Bible reading for the week. You know, I know Old Testament Leviticus has been a little challenging. Look at Ephesians chapter 5, verses 17 to 33. And we'll look at this more in detail next week. But look at the context of how it calls us to be filled with the Spirit. And then it flows down later to wives and husbands. How are we to see those roles in marriage? Are you a wife to the glory of God? Are you a husband to the glory of God? And in your marriage, do you portray Christ? I mean, that's what we're supposed to do with marriage. It's not about me. It's not about our temporal agenda here on earth. There is a heavenly agenda. But marriage is meant to proclaim Christ. And that then affects how we treat each other in marriage. We don't treat our marriage partner as someone who is simply supposed to be there for me, for what I get out of them. Do you point them to Christ? You know, one of the challenges of our church situation is we have a lot of young families here. And then you have families with a lot of little kids. And it's hard. That's why the practical thing that Paul points out. There are troubles, there are concerns, there are challenges that come with marriage and children. But the one thing you are never excused from is, are you living to the glory of God? Are you seeking first his kingdom? Are you living for eternal things? Have you set your mind on things above? I mean, I'm just as guilty. Why is it so easy to spend so much time on things below? not things above. I mean, there are some people who think that coming to church for just an hour and a half or two, whoa, you're asking a lot. It might be the only time you ever actually engage in something that was eternal, that was related to the kingdom of Christ. You know, there is a calling we have that's meant to set us apart. You know, one of the things that if you get in reading the Old Testament about how God made all these rules and these regulations, they were so specific. They were meant, and this is what I was highlighting in my Bible, it was because of Yahweh, because of the Lord, for the Lord, to the Lord. It was a sacrifice to the Lord. It was always to God. Everything was about God. You know, we get hung up because it's like, why do I have to deal with all this detail? Well, ask yourself, do you do it for the Lord's sake? And that's why there's been a bit of a burden, you know, when I think about both the issue of singleness and marriage. These are real challenges. But how are we taking whatever status we're at and making the most of it for the glory of God? Now, we're all in the same boat. Okay? It's not because anyone here is necessarily so great at being single or great at being married, but we're meant to come alongside each other and know that we are facing a battle. I mean, this world clearly wants to destroy God's definition of marriage. I mean, it's just so blatant. So how do we then live out marriage in a world that hates God's definition? And it's very clear this world wants you as a single to be so consumed with yourself, love of self. I mean, you have advertisement that unashamedly promotes that message. Is your singleness all about you? Or is your singleness about Christ? We wrestle through this day after day, week after week. Time will go by, and you will one day realize you're old. I mean, that's kind of how I feel. We went to visit our family, Angela's side of the family, for Memorial Day, and I played pickleball for the first time. And Coleman, yes, so we need to start a pickleball ministry. Oh my goodness, I was so sore. And in my mind, I thought I could do this. It looks so simple. And I'm playing against kids. I could destroy them. And I lost. It was so humbling. Actually, Angela and our great niece beat me. And I thought, wow, you know, back in the day, I thought I was capable. And now I could barely play something that actually was designed for old people. How do you make the most of your days? You know, Paul says, the days are evil in Ephesians 5. So do you make the most of the days? We will still face challenges. We will still wrestle. But we need to fight for this together. We as a church family have an opportunity to encourage our single folks to love Christ more. And single folks, you're here to help the married folks love Christ more. We do this together. We support each other. And we pick each other up. There are those who fall in the battle. Are we there simply just to look at them and say, too bad for you? Or do we say you're part of the team? You're part of this church family. We really need to care for each other in these ways. Now, next week I'll talk about marriage and then parenting and children. You know, we have all these children. God's blessed our church with many children. But there's a war out there
to destroy their souls. And we need to care, not just because they're our own children, it's because they are precious souls that God has given to us as a church family. And I ask you to bow your heads as we prepare for communion.